made by Catherine Melody regarding the fact that the United States should stay involved in the Middle East to promote human rights efforts. First of all, military intervention from the U.S. has stepped on the toes of democracy and human rights in numerous countries over and over in favor of their own economic or political advantages. We've seen this multiple times in the fact that the U.S. routinely works with dictators and fascists if it supports their oil interests or if it's to support economic and trade efforts, because primarily the U.S. has always been concerned with their own security over the human rights well-being of those outside of their country. This also is worth noting that the U.S. has many of their own human rights issues. We are a country with massive amounts of income inequality, which is absurd to most other countries. When UN evaluators came in, they were shocked to see some of the conditions that people just routinely live in here in the United States, especially in poorer neighborhoods or rural towns, which have less access to the common utilities that a lot of people seem are indicative of the United States lifestyle that many of us have in larger cities. We also have been, just in the last year, seeing our government calling for restrictions on those who can apply for political asylum, which heavily damages their ability to improve their own well-being and life, and is human rights damage in the sense that many of these people are legally trying to apply for asylum and trying to flee from massive amounts of violence and damage, but are being blocked somewhat deliberately by the United States government, who has been imposing increased restrictions on these processes rather than making it easier for these people to live a life in safety. Not to mention the United States still has prisons for profit and use prison laborers for things like fighting fires, which they get paid a penance for and are risking their lives very, very literally. And that in and of itself, the fact that we are making profit off of these prisoners and putting them in situations that risk their lives a lot of the times with the type of labor they can go into, is absolutely absurd and shouldn't be happening in any truly developed country. Catherine then goes on to mention religious and cultural values, which, while a valid point and not wanting to downplay the damage and threat that ISIS poses to this community, United States involvement also generally provides force to comply to certain aspects of U.S. Values. Generally, this shows up in economic ways, but it also can show up in cultural values like trying to, objections to Islam and the certain religious tenets, which are very prevalent in a lot of Middle Eastern cultures, the United States finds hostile or doesn't seem friendly to their way of living and would rather more of the population relinquish parts of their lifestyle for those interests, while not super overt and not, killing people for their religious values, which, yes, ISIS does, and not at all to downplay or compare some of those things. The United States still generally encourages a good level of westernization from countries that it helps and supports. She also mentions extrajudicial processes and killings, kidnappings, torturings from these Middle Eastern governments, which does happen in a large amount, but the United States has their own issues with that. Just this year, it's been all over the news. There was a United States citizen who was detained and labeled as an enemy combatant as they were fleeing Syria and handed over to the United States. This person was locked away for over a year. The United States attempted to fight against giving this person their due process rights, tried to prevent this person from being able to see a lawyer, tried to prevent court agreements that would demand him be released into a third country. They tried to release this man back into Syria. And after almost a year in detention with no clear charges against this man, just the vague accusation of being an enemy combatant, providing no evidence for this, the United States was finally forced by court order to release him as a free man into a third-party country that was unnamed. So the United States also has their own fare of extrajudicial attempts and their own justifications for things that shouldn't be happening as citizens and attempt to, for their own political reasons, make certain people disappear or be of less value or no longer be able to have their due process rights. So there is great concern about why they would be trying to prevent this person from their day in court as well. And you mentioned that these Middle Eastern governments don't act like it's a problem, but we see here in our own country, our U.S. government fought for that man to remain in detention, continues passing taxes and bills that increase income inequality rather than decrease it, continued building of tents and encampments and prison labor, as well as these asylum restrictions in detaining these asylum applicants. So our government also has a terrible human rights track record that we don't see as a problem or refuse to address. And so the final point I would like to counter is the lack of wanting to use diplomatic means. We can trace a lot of conflict back to the United States not wanting to use diplomatic means. In 2001, when the United States demanded the extradition of Osama bin Laden into their custody, and Afghanistan demanded there be evidence for this and would be open to debates of releasing him either into a third-party country or at least needing concrete evidence of his involvement in the September 11th attacks, the United States refused to provide this evidence and accused the request for it as a stalling tactic, and then used this as justification for their intervention in Afghanistan and their continued involvement into that for several years. So it's worth noting that the United States, in and of itself, does not hold up to the human rights standard and therefore is not a great candidate to be upholding or creating that standard for any other country.